This unruly hair doesn't belong here. Martha's voice slices through the stunned silence, her scissors snipping viciously at Liana's long beaded braids. The polished marble floor of the Whitaker estate catches the falling strands, each one a piece of Liana's pride, her heritage severed before a gasping crowd. Rain drums the windows, amplifying the cruelty of the moment as Liana stands frozen, her eyes wide with shock yet blazing with defiance. Why would a mother-in-law commit such a heartless act? What secrets does Liana hold that could unravel this? Eastern Dynasty's Pride. Subscribe now to join the journey and drop a comment. Where are you listening from and what time is it? What do you think happens next? Will Liana crumble or will her truth shake the foundations of this family? Stay with us to find out. You won't want to miss a single word. The air in the Whitaker estate's kitchen hung heavy with the scent of sizzling onions and jasmine drifting through the open windows. A fragile truce against the humid weight of the Charleston summer, Liana stood at the stove, her wooden spoon carving slow circles through a pot of okra stew, the rhythmic clink of beads in her long braided hair a quiet rebellion against the silence. At 27, she moved with a dancer's grace, her apron dusted with flour, sweat beading on her warm brown skin. The stew bubbled its earthy warmth, a piece of her grandmother's Geechee legacy, a tether to a past she clung to amidst the polished marble counters and crystal chandeliers of this alien world. Today was the Whitaker family reunion, and Liana was determined to prove she belonged not just to Adrian, her husband, but to his lineage, an Eastern dynasty that wore its pride like armor. She hummed a low spiritual, the note soft as the rain pattering on the roof, grounding her nerves. Her braids swayed, each bead a glint of defiance, a declaration of who she was, in a house that seemed to whisper she wasn't enough. Adrian's text from earlier glowed in her mind. "You've got this, love." But he was in New York, delayed by a work crisis, leaving her to face his family alone. The thought tightened her chest, but she pushed it down, arranging magnolia centerpieces with hands that refused to tremble. She'd make this day perfect for him. For them. The kitchen door swung open, and Martha's heels clicked like a metronome on the hardwood. Liana's spine stiffened, but she didn't turn, focusing on the stew's simmer. Martha Whitaker, the matriarch, was a vision of controlled elegance, late 60s, sharp blue eyes, her silver blonde hair pulled into a severe chignon, her rosewater perfume cut through the kitchen's warmth, a cloying intrusion. She paused, inspecting the platters of shrimp and grits with a curled lip. "These dishes are bold," Martha said, her voice a blade wrapped in silk. "Perhaps too much for our guests." Liana forced a smile, her spoon never faltering. "I thought they'd appreciate a taste of Charleston's roots, Martha, something from my family's traditions." The words were steady, but her heart thudded, sensing the weight behind Martha's gaze. Not on the food, but on her. Martha's eyes narrowed, raking over Liana's braids, the beads catching the light like tiny stars. "Your hair is quite a statement," she said, her tone icy. "This is a Whitaker event, dear. Subtlety matters." The words landed like a slap, their meaning clear. "You don't belong." Liana's fingers tightened on the spoon, but she kept her voice even. "It's just my hair, Martha. Part of who I am." Martha's lips thinned, a flicker of disdain crossing her face before she turned on her heels, retreating. Liana exhaled, the air suddenly lighter, but the sting lingered. She'd felt those eyes before. 2 years of marriage, countless dinners where Martha's smiles never reached her eyes, where every dish Liana cooked was interesting but never praised. The Whitakers were old money, their lineage a tapestry of shipping wealth and political clout. And to Martha, Liana was a tear in that fabric, a woman with no pedigree to match their name. The front door chimed, and voices spilled into the foyer. Early guests, their laughter a stark contrast to the kitchen's tension. Liana smoothed her apron, carrying a tray of cornbread to the dining hall. Elise, a cousin in her 30s, arrived first, her smile tentative. "Smells amazing, Liana," she said, but her eyes darted to the kitchen door, where Martha's shadow loomed. Martha's glare silenced Elise's warmth, and Liana's heart sank. Even kindness here came with conditions. She set the tray down, her braids brushing her shoulders, and caught her reflection in a silver picture. Dark eyes, high cheekbones, a face that carried her grandmother's strength. She wasn't here to shrink. She'd spent months planning this reunion, blending her Geechee recipes with the Whitakers' favorites, hoping to weave herself into their story. But Martha's words echoed. Subtlety matters. A code for conformity, for erasing the parts of Liana that didn't fit their mold. Another guest entered, a distant uncle whose name she couldn't recall. He took a glass of sweet tea from her tray, his eyes lingering on her braids before muttering, "Quite the spread." The compliment felt hollow, his gaze a mirror of Martha's judgment. Liana nodded, her smile practiced, and returned to the kitchen, where the stew's aroma wrapped around her like a hug. She checked her phone. No new messages from Adrian. The ache of his absence grew, but she whispered to herself, "Just get through today." The rain thickened its patter, a steady drum against the estate's roof, and more voices filled the foyer. Liana tied her braids back, the beads clicking softly, a reminder of who she was. She'd faced the Whitakers, their whispers, their stares, with the same strength that had carried her ancestors through harder storms. But as Martha's rosewater scent lingered in the air, a chill settled in Liana's bones. This wasn't just a reunion. It was a battlefield, and she was unarmed. Her only shield, the love she carried for Adrian and the heritage woven into every bead of her hair. Liana's fingers tightened around the dish towel, the coarse fabric grounding her as Martha's voice echoed from the foyer, summoning guests with a honeyed warmth that never reached her eyes. The kitchen, still fragrant with okra stew and cornbread, felt like a shrinking sanctuary, its warmth no match for the chill of Martha's parting words. Subtlety matters. Liana's braids, tied back, brushed her neck, their beads a soft clink against the rising hum of voices outside. She straightened, her reflection in the silver picture, a fleeting reminder of her grandmother's unyielding spirit. The reunion was only beginning, and Adrian's absence was a hollow ache, but she wouldn't falter. Not yet. Carrying a tray of sweet tea, Liana stepped into the foyer, where the chandelier's golden light danced on polished marble. Relatives streamed in, shaking off rain-soaked coats, their laughter sharp and foreign. Her braids caught the glow, a vibrant contrast to the muted elegance of tailored suits and pastel dresses. She offered glasses, her smile practiced, but their responses were curt, eyes flicking to her hair before sliding away. Uncle Howard, a barrel-chested man with a ruddy face, took a glass and grunted, "You're Adrian's wife, huh? Quite a unique addition." His tone dripped with condescension, and Liana's jaw tightened, but she nodded, her voice steady. "Glad you could make it, sir." The words felt like ash, but she pressed on, weaving through the crowd. Elise, the cousin who'd briefly warmed to her in the kitchen, stood near the staircase, her eyes darting to Martha's silhouette in the dining room. Liana offered her tea, hoping for an ally, but Elise's smile was thin, her whisper barely audible. "Thanks, but maybe keep a low profile today." The advice, laced with fear, stung worse than silence. Liana's tray trembled, but she steadied it, her braids swaying as she turned back to the kitchen. Martha's heels clicked behind her, a predator's rhythm. "Liana, dear, we need more ice," she called, her voice loud enough to draw eyes. "Don't dawdle." The command was a performance, a reminder of Liana's place. Liana nodded, retreating to the kitchen, where the clatter of pans drowned out the foyer's chatter. Alone, she leaned against the counter, the damp scent of rain-soaked air mingling with buttery cornbread. Her phone buzzed. Adrian texting, "Flight delayed again." "I'm so sorry, love. You okay?" Her fingers hovered, wanting to confess the weight of Martha's stares, but she typed instead, holding up, "Hurry back." She couldn't burden him, not now. The kitchen door creaked, and Martha entered, her rosewater perfume a clawing invasion. She inspected a tray of shrimp and grits, her lips pursing. "This is far too spicy for our tastes," she sighed as if Liana had committed a personal offense. "You should have consulted me." Liana's pulse quickened, but she kept her tone even. "It's a Geechee recipe, Martha, a tradition from my family. I thought it would honor Charleston." Martha's eyes snapped to hers, cold and unyielding. "Tradition here is ours, not yours." The words were a blade slicing through Liana's resolve. She wanted to snap back, to defend the legacy woven into every dish. But Martha's gaze shifted to her braids, a flicker of disdain crossing her face. "And that hair," she added almost to herself, "it's so loud." Her fingers brushed a pair of ornate silver scissors on the counter, their glint catching Liana's eye. An heirloom she'd heard was used for family ceremonies. The moment passed, but a chill settled in Liana's bones. Martha's touch on the scissors lingering like a threat. She escaped to the dining hall, setting out platters as the crowd grew louder. Overhearing Elise's voice, she paused, hidden by a velvet curtain. "She doesn't fit here, does she?" Elise whispered to another cousin, her tone heavy with pity. "Martha's never going to let her in." The words carved a hollow in Liana's chest, her hands trembling as she adjusted a napkin. She wasn't invisible. She was a wound, noticed only to be prodded. Her braids felt heavier, their beads a lifeline to a strength she feared was slipping. The rain softened to a drizzle, but the mansion's air grew denser, charged with unspoken judgments. Liana returned to the kitchen, tying her braids tighter, the beads clicking like a prayer. She'd planned this reunion for months, blending her heritage with the Whitakers to build a bridge, but every step felt like crossing a minefield. Martha's voice rang out again, calling guests to the dining room for the formal toast. Liana's phone stayed silent, no new word from Adrian. She whispered to herself, "Just get through today," her voice barely audible over the clink of glasses beyond the door. Stepping into the hall, she caught Martha's silhouette near the dining table, the heirloom scissors now prominently displayed for the upcoming ribbon-cutting ceremony. Martha's eyes met hers, sharp and unyielding, a predator sizing up prey. She was here for Adrian, for the life they'd built, and no amount of whispers or stares would break her. But as Martha's gaze lingered, a shadow of something darker, something cruel, flickered in her eyes, and Liana knew this day was far from over. Liana's pulse hammered as Martha's gaze pinned her, a predator's stare slicing through the dining hall's golden haze. The heirloom scissors gleamed on the mahogany table, their silver edges catching the chandelier's light like a warning. Liana lifted her chin, her braids swaying, their beads a soft clink against the rising tide of voices. The Whitaker reunion was shifting into its formal rhythm, and she refused to let Martha's shadow break her. Adrian's absence was a raw ache, but she'd carry this moment for them both. Her love a shield against the whispers that still echoed from the foyer. The dining room thrummed with the clatter of silverware and the low hum of relatives settling into their seats. Liana slipped to the buffet, her hands steady as she arranged a platter of collard greens, their earthy scent mingling with the wax of flickering candles. A dull ache unfurled across her lower back, a ghost of the accident that had stolen her memories, and for a moment she shifted her weight, willing the pain to ease. Her breath came shallow, her chest tight as if her ribs had turned to iron. Her braids framed her face, a vibrant defiance against the room's muted elegance. Pastel dresses, tailored suits, and faces that watched her with guarded curiosity. She was a flame in their monochrome world, and they couldn't look away. Martha stood at the table's head, her silver blonde chignon flawless, her voice ringing out as she raised a crystal glass to Whitaker heritage. She declared, her tone rich with pride, a legacy of strength and tradition. Her eyes swept the room, landing on Liana with a flicker of disdain. "We cherish our traditions, unlike some newcomers." The words were a dart cloaked in civility, and the room stilled, relatives shifting uncomfortably. Liana's fingers tightened on the platter, but she kept her expression serene, her grandmother's voice whispering in her mind, "Hold your head high, child." Her pulse skittered, a fine tremor fluttering in her hands, but she pressed them against her thighs, steadying herself before she moved. She moved silently, refilling glasses, her braids brushing her shoulders. Aunt Miriam, a wiry woman in her 70s with kind eyes, leaned forward as Liana passed. "This stew's divine, child," she whispered, her smile a rare warmth. Liana nodded, gratitude flickering, but Martha's voice cut through like ice. "Liana, dear, more wine for Mr. Harris." The command was sharp, a public reminder of her role. Liana complied, her steps measured, but Martha wasn't done. She leaned toward a cousin, her voice carrying. "Her hair's quite the distraction. Doesn't it hardly suit our aesthetic?" The room seemed to tighten, the air thick with candle smoke and unspoken tension. Liana's heart thudded, Martha's words a deliberate blade aimed at her identity. Her braids, woven with her grandmother's love, were no distraction. They were her. She paused, meeting Martha's gaze, and said, "It's part of who I am, Martha. I thought family embraced that." Her voice was calm, a quiet defiance that rippled through the room. Elise, the cousin who'd whispered doubts earlier, blinked, a flicker of respect crossing her face. Aunt Miriam's lips curved, but Martha's eyes narrowed, her control fraying like a taut thread. The scissors on the table seemed to pulse, their presence louder in Liana's mind. They were for the ribbon-cutting ceremony, a Whittaker tradition to mark the reunion's peak. But Martha's earlier touch on them lingered, a shadow of intent. Liana forced her focus back to the buffet, her hands arranging napkins with deliberate care. Her lower back pulsed with a dull, relentless ache, a reminder that even standing here demanded something from her she wasn't sure she could spare. She shifted her weight, fighting the tightness in her chest. A cousin, emboldened by the wine, called out, "Liana, tell us about these dishes. Your family's from here." The question felt genuine, a crack in the wall of judgment. She seized it, her voice soft but clear. "My grandmother was Geechee, born on the islands. She taught me these recipes, collards, grits, stew. They're stories, not just food." The room listened, some nodding, others leaning forward. Elise's eyes softened, and even Uncle Howard, the gruff patriarch, grunted approval. For a moment, Liana felt the bridge she'd dreamed of building, her heritage weaving into theirs. Martha's glass clinked sharply against the table, shattering the warmth. "Let's focus on the family's history, not hers," she said, her smile ablade. The dismissal was a whip crack, snapping the room back to her command. Liana's chest tightened, her breath catching as a ripple of dizziness edged her vision. The fleeting connection snuffed out. She returned to her spot near the buffet, her braids a heavy crown, their beads catching the light like defiant stars. The rain tapped the windows, a steady rhythm that matched her pulse, urging her to hold fast. Elise leaned toward Aunt Miriam, her whisper barely audible. "She's trying so hard. Martha's too harsh." The words were a lifeline, but they couldn't erase the weight of Martha's stare, now fixed on Liana with a cold intensity. The matriarch's fingers brushed the scissors again, a fleeting gesture that sent a shiver down Liana's spine. She wanted to text Adrian, to beg him to hurry, to tell him she wasn't sure how much longer she could pretend her heart wasn't pounding itself raw, but her phone was in the kitchen, and Martha's presence was a cage. The dining hall buzzed as Martha announced the ribbon-cutting ceremony, her voice saccharine. "Liana, you'll assist me," she said, her eyes glinting with something darker than triumph. "Let's make this memorable." The words were a trap, their weight sinking into Liana's bones. She nodded, her throat tight, her braids swaying as she stepped forward. The scissors gleamed, their edges a promise of something cruel, and the room watched, oblivious to the storm gathering in Martha's gaze. Liana's heart roared, but she held her ground, her grandmother's strength a whisper in her soul. "You are enough." The ceremony loomed, and with it a reckoning she couldn't yet name. Martha's command hung like a guillotine. Her words, "Let's make this memorable," a velvet-wrapped threat that coiled around Liana's throat. The dining room's chandelier cast a fractured glow, its light glinting off the heirloom scissors on the mahogany table, their silver edges sharp as Martha's gaze. Liana stood at the head of the table, a crimson ribbon clutched in her hands, her braids framing a face taut with unease. The rain's relentless drumbeat against the windows mirrored her pulse, a frantic rhythm urging her to flee, but she held her ground. Her grandmother's whisper, a lifeline, "You are enough." The Whittakers watched, their faces a mosaic of curiosity and complicity, oblivious to the storm brewing in Martha's eyes. The ribbon-cutting ceremony, a Whittaker tradition to seal the reunion's unity, felt like a stage for Martha's wrath. Liana's braids swayed, their beads catching the candlelight, a defiant emblem of her heritage. Amidst the sea of pastel dresses and starched collars, she forced her hands steady, the ribbon silk cool against her skin. As Martha stepped beside her, her rosewater perfume a cloying shroud. "Hold it taut, dear," Martha said, her voice saccharine, but her eyes were cold. A predator savoring the kill. Liana nodded, her throat tight, sensing the trap, but bound by duty and hope that she could still salvage this day for Adrian. Relatives leaned forward, glasses clinking, their murmurs a low hum. Elise, her earlier whisper of sympathy now silenced, watched with wide eyes, while Aunt Miriam's brow furrowed, sensing something amiss. Martha raised the scissors, their blades flashing, and began, "This ribbon binds our legacy, our pride." Her words were for the crowd, but her gaze locked on Liana, a silent accusation. "You don't belong." Liana met her eyes, her voice soft but firm. Unity is a beautiful thing, Martha. I'm honored to be part of it. The words, laced with grace, were a spark in the tinder of Martha's resentment. A guest, emboldened by the wine, called out, "Well said, Liana." The approval, fleeting but real, rippled through the room, Elise nodding faintly, Aunt Miriam's lips curving. Martha's face contorted, her control slipping like sand through her fingers. Liana's poise, her refusal to shrink, was a direct challenge, and the matriarch's rage ignited. "Poise doesn't make you a Whittaker," she snapped, her voice a whip crack that silenced the murmurs. Liana's heart lurched, but she held steady, replying, "Respect does, Martha. I'm trying." The quiet defiance was aflame, and Martha's eyes blazed with fury. In a swift, venomous motion, Martha seized the scissors and lunged, not at the ribbon, but at Liana's braids. The blades sliced, a sickening snip echoing in the stunned silence, and a thick section of Liana's hair fell, beads clattering to the marble floor like shattered dreams. "This is a Whittaker event, not your stage," Martha hissed, her voice raw with triumph. The severed braids lay scattered, each strand a piece of Liana's pride, her heritage torn away before the gasping crowd. The room froze, the rain's roar the only sound amplifying the violation. Liana stood motionless, her hand clutching the fallen strands, their beads digging into her palm. Her eyes were wide, not with tears, but with a haunting defiance, a fire that refused to die. The pain was a tidal wave crashing against her heart, not just the loss of her hair, but the stripping of her identity, her grandmother's legacy in this gilded cage of prejudice. Relatives gaped, Elise covering her mouth, Aunt Miriam shaking her head, but none spoke, their silence a heavier betrayal than Martha's act. Martha sat, her expression smug, the scissors glinting in her hand, believing she'd broken the intruder in their midst. The air thickened, candle smoke curling like ghosts, the damp scent of rain seeping through the windows. Liana's knees trembled, but she bent slowly, picking up a single braid, its beads catching the light like defiant stars. Her movements were deliberate, a silent vow. "You won't erase me." She straightened, meeting Martha's gaze, her eyes burning with a strength that made the matriarch's smirk falter. The room watched, breathless, as Liana's silence spoke louder than any scream, her dignity a fortress against the cruelty. Elise's whisper broke the hush, barely audible to Aunt Miriam. "She didn't deserve that." The words were a crack in the family's complicity, but they couldn't undo the violation. Liana's voice, when it came, was a whisper, raw and resolute. "You can't cut away who I am." The declaration hung, a challenge to Martha's power, and the matriarch's fingers tightened on the scissors, her triumph souring. The dining room door creaked open, and a figure stepped through, rain-soaked and commanding. Marcus, his tailored coat dripping, he scanned the room, his eyes locking on Liana's shorn hair. His voice cut through the silence, steady and unyielding. "She's my sister." The words were a thunderclap, shattering the room's fragile stillness. Relatives turned, mouths agape, as Martha's face paled, her scissors clattering to the table. Liana's breath caught, the braid in her hand a lifeline as Marcus's gaze held hers, a promise of truths yet to unfold. The rain roared on, but a new storm was rising, one that would upend this house of pride. Marcus's words, "She's my sister," hung like a lightning strike, electrifying the dining room. Stunned silence. Liana stood frozen, her severed braids clutched in her hand, their beads digging into her palm like anchors against the chaos. The chandelier's glow cast jagged shadows, and the rain's relentless roar outside seemed to echo the storm breaking within her. Martha's scissors clattered to the mahogany table, her smugness dissolving as her pale face. The Whittakers gaped, their glasses forgotten, as Liana's eyes locked on this stranger, his face stirring a flicker of something deep, unplaceable beneath the fog of her pain. Marcus stepped forward, his presence commanding, his dark eyes steady with a warmth that cut through the room's chill. "I'm Marcus Bryant," he said, his voice a low, unyielding current, "and Liana's no stranger to our family." The declaration was a blade, slicing through Martha's carefully woven narrative. She laughed, a sharp, brittle sound, rising from her seat. "This is absurd. Some con artist crashing our reunion." Her voice trembled, betraying the crack in her armor. But Marcus's gaze didn't waver, pinning her like a specimen under glass. Liana's breath hitched, her fingers tightening around the braids, their weight a reminder of Martha's cruelty moments ago. Marcus's face, high cheekbones, a jawline that mirrored her own, felt like a half-remembered dream stirring an ache she couldn't name. Her amnesia, a shadow from a childhood accident, had left her past a blank canvas, but his words painted colors she didn't know she'd lost. I don't remember," she whispered, her voice raw, barely audible over the rain's drumbeat. The admission was a wound laid bare, but her eyes never left his, searching for truth. Marcus softened, stepping closer, his coat's damp scent mingling with the candle smoke. "You were 10, he said, his tone gentle but firm. "A car accident took you from us. Amnesia stole your memories, but we never stopped looking." He gestured to the fallen braids on the floor, their beads glinting like scattered stars. "Those braids, Mom taught you, just like she taught me. They're ours, Liana." The words were a lifeline, threading through the fog of her mind, and Liana's heart lurched, a spark of recognition flaring despite the void. Martha's voice cut in, shrill with desperation. "Nonsense, she's my son's wife, nothing more." She clutched the table's edge, her knuckles white, but the room was shifting. Elise, her eyes wide, whispered to Aunt Miriam, "Could it be true?" Miriam's nod was subtle, her gaze on Liana softening with guilt. The relatives' murmurs grew, a tide turning against Martha's reign. Marcus ignored her, his focus on Liana, his voice a steady anchor. "You're not alone anymore," he said, and the promise wrapped around her like a shield. Liana's knees trembled, the severed braids in her hand a tangible link to the heritage Martha had tried to erase. The violation still burned, her hair, her grandmother's legacy, torn away in front of this gilded crowd. But Marcus's presence was a counterforce, a spark of hope. Amidst the wreckage, she wanted to ask 1,000 questions, to unravel. The life he claimed was hers, but her throat was tight, her mind a whirl of confusion and longing. The rain's rhythm seemed to slow its roar, a backdrop to the truth unfolding. Martha's laughter faltered, her eyes darting to the relatives, seeking allies. "You believe this charade?" she demanded, but her voice cracked, her authority fraying. Uncle Howard shifted uncomfortably, his earlier condescension gone, while Elise's gaze lingered on Liana, a silent apology forming. Aunt Miriam spoke, her voice low but clear. "Let him speak, Martha. We've seen enough cruelty today." The words were a rebuke, and Martha's face paled, her grip on the table tightening as the room's loyalty slipped. Marcus turned to Liana, his eyes softening. "Your braids," he said, nodding to the strands she held. "They're part of our story. Mom used to say they carried our strength, our history." The mention of her mother sent a jolt through Liana, a memory flickering, a woman's hands weaving her hair, laughter, warmth. It was faint, like a star behind clouds, but it was there. She clutched the braids tighter, their beads a pulse against her skin, grounding her in this moment of upheaval. The dining room door creaked again, and Marcus glanced back, his expression shifting to one of quiet resolve. "Our parents are here," he said, his voice steady. "They'll explain everything." Liana's breath caught, her eyes darting to the foyer, where the sound of footsteps echoed, deliberate and commanding. The relatives turned, their whispers rising, as Martha's face drained of color, her scissors abandoned on the table. Liana's heart pounded, the braids in her hand a lifeline to a past she couldn't yet grasp, but one that was rushing toward her. She stood taller, her shorn hair framing a face that refused to break. Martha's act had meant to shatter her, to strip her of her identity. But Marcus's words were rebuilding it, piece by piece. The rain roared on, a symphony of chaos, but Liana's gaze held Marcus's, a silent vow. She was ready to know who she was. The footsteps grew louder, and with them a truth that would shake this house to its foundations. The echo of footsteps in the foyer was a heartbeat, steady and commanding, pulling every eye from Marcus's resolute face to the dining room's threshold. Liana stood rooted, her severed braids clutched like a talisman, their beads a faint pulse against her palm. The chandelier's light spilled into the hall, catching the rain-slick marble, and her breath caught as two figures emerged, elegant, unyielding, their presence a tide that shifted the room's gravity. Marcus's voice, still ringing in her ears, "Our parents are here," was a promise now made flesh, and Liana's heart roared, torn between confusion and a longing she couldn't name. The couple stepped forward, their silhouettes sharp against the foyer's glow. Richard Bryant, tall and broad-shouldered, his graying hair cropped close, carried an air of quiet authority, his dark eyes locking onto Liana with a father's unspoken grief. Elaine beside him was a vision of grace, her braided hair mirroring the style Liana's had been before Martha's scissors struck, her face a map of love and loss. "My baby," Elaine whispered, her voice trembling, a single tear tracing her cheek. The room held its breath, the rain's fading rhythm a soft counterpoint to the truth unfolding. Marcus gestured to them, his voice steady. "Richard and Elaine Bryant, our parents." He turned to Liana, his eyes softening. "You're their daughter, Liana, lost to us for 15 years. The words were a beacon, piercing the fog of her amnesia, and Liana's gaze darted to Elaine's braids, their familiar patterns stirring a memory. A woman's hands, gentle and sure, weaving her hair under a sunlit porch. It was faint, but it was hers, and her chest tightened with the weight of it. Martha lurched to her feet, her chair scraping the marble floor. "This is a fantasy," she snapped, her voice shrill with desperation. "She's nobody, just my son's wife." Her hands gripped the table, knuckles white. But Richard's deep voice cut through, calm and unyielding. "She's our daughter, stolen by a car accident and amnesia. You've insulted her heritage, her family." His words were a gavel, and the relatives murmured, their eyes shifting from Martha to the Bryants, whose poise dwarfed the Whitakers' fading grandeur. Liana's knees trembled, the severed braids in her hand a bridge to the past. Elaine's presence promised. "I don't remember, but I feel something," she stammered, her voice raw, her eyes fixed on Elaine's face, so like her own, yet etched with years of searching. Elaine stepped closer, her silk dress rustling, and gently touched Liana's shorn hair, her fingers trembling. "These braids were our bond," she said, her voice thick with love. "We'd sit for hours weaving stories into them. Our strength, our history. We'll make new ones together." Liana's eyes stung, the weight of her lost years crashing against the warmth of Elaine's touch. Elise's whisper to Aunt Miriam broke the hush. "Martha went too far," she said, her voice laced with guilt. Miriam nodded, her gaze on Liana now one of respect, not pity. The room's murmurs grew, a tide of doubt eroding Martha's reign. Martha's face drained of color, her earlier smugness a ghost as she snapped. "You expect us to believe this charade?" But her voice cracked, her authority crumbling under the Bryant's undeniable stature. Uncle Howard leaned back, his silence a betrayal, while Elise's eyes lingered on Liana, a silent plea for forgiveness. Marcus stepped beside Liana, his hand grazing her shoulder, a brother's reassurance. "The Bryants built an empire in Atlanta. Real estate, philanthropy, influence that makes the Whitakers look small," he said, his tone matter-of-fact but cutting. "Liana's one of us. Always was." The revelation was a thunderclap, and Liana's heart raced, the void of her amnesia filling with fragments, laughter, a porch swing, braids under her mother's hands. She clutched the severed strands tighter, their beads a lifeline to the heritage Martha had tried to erase. Elaine's eyes met Liana's, a mother's love piercing the years. "You were our light," she said, her voice breaking. "We never stopped looking." Richard nodded, his gaze sweeping the room, a challenge to the Whitakers' pride. "Your matriarch attacked our daughter's identity," he said, his tone even but searing. "Her braids carried our legacy, and you tried to cut it away." The words hung, a mirror to Martha's cruelty, and the relatives shifted, their loyalty fracturing. Liana's voice, when it came, was a whisper, yet it carried. "I don't know everything yet," she said, her eyes on Elaine, "but I know I'm not nobody." The declaration was a spark, igniting her resolve, and Elaine's tearful smile was a balm to the wound Martha's scissors had carved. The dining room's air thickened, the candlelight flickering as if bowing to the truth. Martha slumped, her hands trembling, the scissors a forgotten relic of her failed triumph. Marcus glanced at the foyer, his voice steady. "There's more to tell, Liana, and we're here to help you remember." The promise was a vow, and Liana nodded, her shorn hair framing a face alight with purpose. The rain softened its rhythm, a gentle cadence, but the storm within the mansion was far from over. Elaine's hand lingered on Liana's, a tether to a past reclaimed. And as the relatives whispered, their eyes on the Bryants, Liana knew the foundations of this house were shaking, ready to crack under the weight of her truth. Liana's whisper, "I'm not nobody," still echoed, a spark that set the main hall ablaze with whispers and shifting glances. She stood between Marcus and the Bryants, her severed braids clutched like a battle standard, their beads glinting under the flickering candlelight. Elaine's hand lingered on hers, a mother's warmth anchoring her against the storm of Martha's fading reign. The Whitakers, once a monolith of pride, fractured under the weight of the Bryants' presence, their elegance and authority a mirror to the pettiness of Martha's cruelty. The rain had softened to a murmur, but the tension in the hall was a live wire, crackling with the promise of reckoning. Martha gripped the table's edge, her face ashen, her silver-blonde chignon unraveling like her control. "This is my family," she snapped, her voice darted to the relatives, seeking loyalty, but the room had turned. Elise, her earlier silence a mark of complicity, stood, her voice trembling but clear. "Not anymore, Martha. You went too far." The words were a crack in the Whitaker facade, and Aunt Miriam nodded, her voice low but firm. "She's right. You've shamed us all." Liana's heart pounded, the braids in her hand a pulse of strength. Martha's act, cutting her hair, her heritage, had meant to break her, but the Bryant's truth had forged her anew. She stepped forward, her shorn hair framing a face alight with purpose, and spoke, her voice steady, cutting through the hall's hum. "You tried to cut me down, Martha, but my roots are stronger than your hate." The declaration was a thunderclap, silencing the murmurs. Relatives gaped, their eyes shifting from Martha's trembling form to Liana's unyielding gaze, a woman reborn in the fire of her own truth. Richard Bryant moved beside her, his presence a bulwark, his deep voice measured but searing. "You attacked our daughter's heritage," he said, his eyes sweeping the Whitakers. "The Bryants built an empire on integrity, not prejudice. Your family could learn from her strength." The rebuke was a blade, and Martha flinched, her knuckles whitening. Uncle Howard, once a pillar of Whitaker pride, looked away, his silence a surrender. Elise whispered to a cousin, "She's one of them, a Bryant," her tone awed, a far cry from her earlier doubts. Elaine's hand tightened on Liana's, her braided hair a mirror to the legacy Martha had tried to erase. "You're our light, Liana," she said, her voice thick with love. "No one can dim that." The words were a balm, soothing the raw wound of Martha's scissors, and Liana's eyes stung, not with tears but with a fierce resolve. Her amnesia still clouded her past, but the Bryants' presence filled the void with fragments, laughter, braids, a family she was ready to reclaim. The hall's heavy doors swung open, and Adrian burst through, rain-soaked and breathless, his eyes wide with horror as they landed on Liana's shorn hair. "Mother, what have you done?" he demanded, his voice raw, cutting through the whispers. Martha stammered, her composure shattered. I was protecting our name." But Adrian ignored her, rushing to Liana, his hands framing her face. "I'm so sorry I wasn't here," he whispered, his voice breaking. Liana leaned into his touch, the ache of his absence easing, her braids still clutched in her hand, a testament to her survival. Adrian turned to the room, his gaze fierce. "Liana's my wife, and she's more family than some of you have ever been." The words were a gauntlet thrown at Martha's feet, and the relatives shifted, their silence a reckoning. Liana met his eyes, her voice soft but resolute. "I'm not just your wife, Adrian, I'm Liana Bryant, and I belong here." The declaration was a vow, not just to him, but to herself. And Adrian's nod was a promise, his hand finding hers, grounding her in their shared strength. Elaine stepped forward, her voice warm but firm. "We'd like to host a gathering. Bring our families together," she said, her eyes sweeping the Whitakers. "There's room for change if you're willing." The offer hung, a challenge to their pride, and Elise nodded, her earlier guilt replaced by resolve. Aunt Miriam murmured, "It's time," her words a bridge to a new future. The hall buzzed, the relatives' whispers now laced with possibility, not judgment. Martha slumped, her hands trembling, her eyes darting to the abandoned scissors, a relic of her failed crusade. "You can't take my family," she whispered, but the words were hollow, her authority a ghost. The Whitakers had seen her cruelty laid bare and their loyalty had crumbled, leaving her alone in the hall's fading light. Liana's gaze softened, not with pity but with clarity. She'd survived not just Martha's blade but the weight of a family's prejudice. Adrian squeezed her hand, his voice low. "We'll face this together, Liana." She nodded, the braids in her hand a symbol of what she'd endured and what she'd reclaimed. Marcus stood beside her, his smile a brother's pride, while Richard's steady gaze promised a future where she'd never be alone. The hall's air lightened, the candlelight steady now, as if bowing to Liana's triumph. The rain had nearly stopped, a quiet hush beyond the windows. But Liana knew the true storm was within her, a fire of identity, burning bright, ready to reshape this house and all who dwelt in it. The hall's fading candlelight lingered in Liana's mind as she stepped onto the veranda, the air cool and fresh, washed clean by the retreating storm. The sunset painted the Charleston sky in vibrant oranges and pinks, its glow catching her shorn hair, now a badge of survival rather than shame. She held her severed braids, their beads clicking softly, a testament to the heritage Martha's scissors couldn't erase. Adrian's hand was warm in hers, his presence a steady anchor while Marcus and the Bryants followed, their footsteps a quiet chorus of reclaimed family. The mansion loomed behind, its grandeur humbled by the truths laid bare within, and Liana felt a weight lift, her heart alight with a hard-won peace. She paused at the veranda's edge, touching her cropped hair, the uneven ends a map of her trial. "This doesn't define me," she said, her voice soft but resolute, meeting Adrian's eyes. "It's a reminder, I'm stronger than they thought." His gaze softened, love and guilt mingling. "You're stronger than I ever knew, Liana," he replied, his thumb brushing her knuckles. "I should have been here sooner." She shook her head, squeezing his hand. "You're here now. That's enough." Elaine joined them, her braided hair catching the sunset's fire, a mirror to the legacy Liana was reclaiming. She held a small braid from her own hair, its beads glinting like promises. "We'll weave new ones, Liana," she said, her voice thick with hope. "Like we used to under the Atlanta sun, stories in every knot." Liana's throat tightened, a memory flickering, warm hands, laughter, a porch swing swaying. Her amnesia still clouded the details, but Elaine's love was a beacon, guiding her home. She smiled, the severed braids in her hand lighter now. "I'd like that, Mom," she whispered, up the word a tentative bridge to a past she was ready to embrace. Elise stepped onto the veranda, her steps hesitant, her eyes shadowed with guilt. "Liana, I'm sorry," she said, her voice trembling. "I should have spoken up when Martha, I was wrong." The apology was raw, a crack in the Whitaker armor, and Liana nodded, her gaze steady but kind. "It's a start, Elise. That matters." Aunt Miriam followed her, her wiry frame softened by remorse. "You've shown us what family really means, child," she said, her voice warm. "We've got learning to do." Their words were seeds, fragile but hopeful, planted in the ruins of Martha's prejudice. Richard stood beside Marcus, his presence commanding yet gentle, his eyes sweeping the group. "We offered a gathering, a chance to bring our families together," he said, his deep voice a call to change. "Let's build something better, not just for Liana, but for all of us." Adrian nodded, his jaw set with resolve. "My family's got work to do, starting with me," he said, his hand tightening on Liana's. "We'll be there, Mr. Bryant." The promise hung in the air, a vow to bridge the chasm Martha's cruelty had carved, and Elise's faint smile echoed its hope. Through the dining room window, Martha's silhouette was visible, seated alone, her head bowed. The scissors lay abandoned, a relic of her failed crusade, and her silence was louder than any defense. The Whitakers had turned from her, their whispers now of change, not loyalty. And Liana felt no pity, only clarity. Martha's attempt to erase her had forged something stronger, a woman who knew her worth, her roots, her place. The sunset's glow seemed to dim around Martha, leaving her in shadow, a matriarch dethroned by her own hand. Liana turned to the horizon, her decision clear. She'd stay with Adrian, their love a foundation to build upon. But she'd also reclaim her Bryant heritage, starting with a trip to Atlanta to learn her family's stories, their braids, their strength. "I'm ready to know who I am," she said, her voice a quiet vow, and Elaine's tearful nod was a mother's blessing. Marcus grinned, his brotherly pride a warmth that chased away the last of the day's chill. "You're already her, Liana," he said. "The rest is just catching up." The veranda's wooden boards creaked under their weight, a soft rhythm like the heartbeat of a new beginning. Richard's gaze met Liana's, his voice steady. "You're our daughter, always," he said, and the words filled the voids her amnesia had left, stitching her past to her present. The relatives inside began to spill onto the veranda, their faces tentative but open, drawn to the light of change. Elise murmured to a cousin, "She's a Bryant, but she's one of us too," a bridge forming in her words. Liana stood between Adrian and Elaine, their hands clasped, Marcus and Richard flanking them. The sunset bathed them in golden light, a promise of tomorrows where heritage and love could coexist. Her shorn hair caught the breeze, a symbol of survival, of roots that no blade could sever. The jasmine scent wrapped around them, sweet and unyielding, and Liana's heart swelled, not with pain but with possibility. The mansion behind them was no longer a cage, but a witness to her triumph, its walls echoing the truth she'd claimed. As the horizon glowed, Liana's voice rose, soft but certain. "We'll build something new together." The words were a vow, not just to her family but to herself, a woman forged in fire, ready to weave her story anew. The stars began to pierce the twilight, and she knew with every bead in her hand that her roots would hold her, now and always. As the Charleston sunset fades, Liana stands unbroken, her shorn braids a testament to resilience, her roots a bridge between worlds. Martha's cruelty crumbled, and the Whitakers learned that truth outweighs pride. What's next for Liana and her reclaimed family? Will their gathering heal old wounds? Thank you, dear listeners, for joining this journey of heart and heritage. Your support means everything. Don't forget to like and subscribe to our channel for more stories that grip the soul. Share your thoughts below. What moved you most? Stay tuned for more tales of triumph. Until next time, keep shining.